are talking about more than just accessibility. And I love the wordplay, so let me nerd out for a second, because just is also a play on words with justice. So there's the idea that there is a sense of the justice of creating accessibility for people. Um, and then there's also the reductive sense of just accessibility, like getting by with the bare minimum. And so, what I'm hoping we can do today is really lean into the opportunities that we have in our spiritual communities to go above and beyond and to really approach the topic of DEIJB, which oftentimes the acronym will include A for accessibility. So you might see IDEA, which I believe actually Unity World headquarters uses. So they have IDEA, inclusive or inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And you'll see that A in there often, but that we have an opportunity based on our values, on our theology, and on our principles to really go above and beyond and do more than what's required. And unfortunately, in a way, we aren't actually required to adhere to ADA. So even that language around it, we use loosely. And I think in some regards that protects those who have very old buildings who were built before the ADA, and but also many of us have small staffs. And so even with that, you're only ADA kicks in when an employer has more than 15 staff members, and on and on. There's lots of details wrapped up in that. So for me, it is important for us to come to this from principle and from our values, and to really allow justice to take hold. I mean, scripture is filled with all kinds of writings and reflections about justice. So it is intricately interwoven for me to our theology. So I wanted to give voice someone who identifies as disabled. This is Mia Mingus, and she's a writer, an educator, and a trainer for transformative justice and disability justice. She is a queer, physically disabled Korean, transracial, and transnational adoptee raised in the Caribbean. How about that? So I wanted to include that. It's, how she describes herself so that we could have an idea for that. So this is not her in the left hand picture with the woman on the beach in the wheelchair. It just was more of an energetic capture of where I want us to go today. But here's a video. And so I have lost sight of you all. So I'm actually going to stop sharing again so I can see you and make sure. Are there any questions? There used to be the little, let's see. Okay, I'm going to keep you there, and I'm going to go back to share the screen so I can put the video on. So, okay.
The way that I have grown up understanding access as a disabled person who's been disabled since I was 6 months old, I've known it, I grew up with it around as done as a form of charity most often, or a form of guilt, or as sometimes even as, this kind of reluctant obligation type of feeling to it. Or I've known it as assimilation, or as a way for people to get more privileges, to not necessarily build a just world, but so that a few privileged disabled people can get a few more privileged crumbs to subsist on. And I think that with disability justice, we're really saying, no, actually, we want a different way, and we don't want access just for the sake of access. We don't want disabled people only to have access to the same crappy system that everybody else has. We want to actually think about how we move towards what a just world would look like for us all, and what liberation really looks like. So that's one core concept. I think another big concept that, at least that I talk about in disability justice work, is interdependency.
Interdependency. Whew, I wanted that video to keep going. So what's your emotional response to that, or even your intellectual response?
Well, I guess I would term this intellectual is just the way that what she was talking about wasn't to kind of settle for, I think she called it like some crumbs of privilege sort of thing. It was like taking what is and while it may have been lacking in certain areas for her, it doesn't mean that what was lacking was the best. And she wants to take it to a higher level that would not only apply to someone in her position, but to everybody, more equally and or equitably. Um, and I'm trying to think real quickly. I'm not recalling a time that I heard anybody from like a marginalized community speaking about wanting something that's even better than what they don't always have access to begin with. So
Mhm.
that's the point that struck me in the snippet that she shared.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? Nicole or James?
I think that terms like liberation and interdependency really helped me better understand the need. It was very eye-opening. It was moving. I learned so much in that brief, what was it, 30
Mhm.
seconds? I don't know. It was
Mhm.
so short, but I learned so much about how this is viewed and how I can view it differently. So
Mhm.
I'm just really grateful for her work and how, understanding more of the experience.
Thank you. And we'll have a little bit more from her too. Yeah. James, do you have anything? Any response?
Well, I think my main thought about it is more along the lines of the conversation about reclaiming just the word disability as a positive in a positive framework and looking at it, in terms of liberation. Like it's not something where she's being apologetic or people need to be apologetic about it. This is just giving access to people with different ability identities who are disabled, which is not a bad word. But I think that sometimes in our culture, we sort of frame it as, a negative or a bad, maybe not on the surface, but, there's definitely that undercurrent of that. So.
Yeah. And what struck me is when she said, we want more than access to the same crappy system that everyone else has. When she put it like that, I was like, it's really a call to awareness and consciousness and intentionality with how we create all of our spaces, virtual and physical, community spaces, transportation spaces, all of that, and how we exist. That in many ways, even in the non-disabled arena, we have fallen asleep to how we create our world. And so I think there's a real opportunity there to roll that in. And again, to me, that's where it really anchors us in our unity theology. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. And so Mia Mingus, I wanted to connect you with her. She is new to me, but she is very well respected, has received lots of awards. And so you'll see on the left-hand side, I've put her link tree, which that just gives you access to all of the ways you can find her. But if you are on X, used to be Twitter, or Instagram at Mia Mingus on both. And then there's also a website, and I actually have rolled it into an extra credit part of your homework. So soiltjp.org, and that stands for Transformation Justice. It's the P, Transformational Justice Project, I think. But what she has come up with, a system that she is working in her justice work, she uses what's called pods, is really similar to how we already operate in spiritual community. And so I think I personally am going to be diving into it, taking a deeper dive into her work for that reason, because I think there's going to be a real easy overlay. And Nicole, especially you, as you're creating a DEIJ team in your community, there's going to be a really nice overlay for how she is structuring it. And like she's talking about keeping their staff small intentionally so that they create these pods, and it's about cultivating leadership, and it's really marvelous. So I hope you take some time to connect with her. But these quotes here really just, I think, capture the energy of what I hope we take to heart and think about. I don't know how you have survived, but I am grateful you are here. I mean, how many times do we say that in ministry to each other and in different words? And so bringing that into, I talked about at the very beginning before we actually started about feeling like the DEIJ world is very corporate in a sense. And part of my effort here is for us to bring it into the spiritual realm and more intimate with our spiritual life, and which is why I added the B for belonging, because to me that really anchors it there. And then this quote on the right: access for the sake of access or inclusion is not necessarily liberatory, but access done in the service of love, justice, connection, and community is liberatory and has the power to transform. Yes, 100%. And this is, why we do what we do. This is why we gather in spiritual community, and we do work, serve the work of love. We do serve the work of justice. We do have an intention for connection, and so that anyone who comes into connection with our community is also reminded of our oneness and or awakened to our oneness. And that is the power of community, and that is absolutely has the power to transform. That is, the nugget in our fifth principle. So I just appreciate that it was not very difficult to find justice workers who are really capturing the essence of what we do in spiritual community. There's for so long sort of this division, and there's some even in some of our spiritual communities and centers. There's still a division about justice work over there, spiritual life over here, and more I think people are becoming more comfortable with uniting the two and marrying the two, and understanding that there is no separation, that this really comes down to how we imagine and outpicture and demonstrate our world from the inner to the outer. Okay. So I would like to introduce to you some barriers. These are just 5, and they're kind of like the grand 5 that most everything else, at least that I could think of, fall into one of these categories. So we have organizational or systemic barriers. We have technological barriers, architectural or physical barriers, information or communication barriers, and my favorite, attitudinal barriers. I mean, come on. Yes, we have attitudinal barriers. So, the one that I was kind of expecting to be called out separately was financial, but I think that could fall under organizational or systemic. It could fall under attitudinal. So it's in there. And I wonder if anything is coming to mind for any of you of other kinds of barriers, or even specifics that might fall into these categories. Or even have you thought about it? Do you think about barriers to accessibility? And I don't know how to find you guys again when I go into screen share. But I can see you now. Any thoughts or ideas about barriers? Do you understand what barriers to accessibility are? So it's anything that creates that. So if you're colorblind and a website has all pastel colors, you're not going to be able to read that website, or if the font is super tiny. Those are barriers to accessibility. Communication. We provide ASL access on Sundays and in our classes and all of our community activities. That's because that language can be a barrier. But we don't provide like Spanish translation or any other language translation. So that can be a barrier to access.
I'm thinking of just historical, which I think
Mhm.
falls within the organization and systemic, but I think about the redlining that occurred in our community. That is a history, it's generations of barriers that have been put up. So I think that it's systemic, but it was just standing out.
Yeah, 100%. And racism is systemic. I think it can also fall into attitudinal. So I think some of these are complex enough that they might stretch across different categories.
So would education stand in that element of information and communication then? Because we don't
Perhaps.
know what we're not doing well or
Mhm.
whatnot. I wanted to see where that might fit in the the
Yeah,
chart.
that's a really good question too, because it could also fall, financial, because if schools aren't getting the funding that they need, because of, the the tax area for them. So I might just throw that in systemic, because it's part of how our systems are set up. But yeah, it's not clear cut, because it all ultimately comes down to the individual experience. So after it's filtered through, after even one single barrier is filtered through, it may not be about whether the button that pushes the automatic door opener functions correctly so that someone in a wheelchair can get through the door. Did that person, do they have a wheelchair that fits their size? Do they, there's like, it goes on and on. It's like a web, right, of our existence and how we function in the world. But so when we think about the barriers, oftentimes we are just sort of encultured to make it about physical and architectural. Like, are the bathroom doors wide enough? Do we have ramps? And then forgetting the detail of, like, are the ramps at a proper steepness? I'm not sure how to say the words escaping me, but we have one ramp on one of our doors that is pretty steep, and so if you have a bigger person, you need someone with the right amount of strength to be able to get them up the ramp. The other ramp that we have on the other door is long, so it has a lower grade. Grade is the word I'm thinking of. It has a lower grade, but you've got to like wind over and around and back and around, and which is okay on a warm spring morning, but not so great in the winter or in a rainstorm or a hailstorm or anything like that. And it also, just her words are ringing in my ears about the same crappy system, you know. And are we just getting crumbs of access? Like, are we getting the minimal? Like, well, at least there's a ramp for you, And so then how do we care about that? How do we show and demonstrate our care? So, we may not be able to change a structure, but what do we do in spiritual community to add love and care around that? Do we go above and beyond to provide support if the ramp has a steep grade, that we know we're going to provide support and the right person who's going to be available week after week to support entry into the building? Lighting, sound, and audio, not just for deaf community but also for hard of hearing, hearing impaired. There are so many different kinds of barriers that we think about structurally, but then when we talk about financial, at least in spiritual community, we'll say, a suggested love offering. But really that's anchored in tax code, right? That's really anchored in, we're required, if we charge a fee, that has a different implications than if we receive a love offering. And then as a side note, it also provides financial accessibility. So how do we language that so that we can maybe make the person more important, the financial accessibility more important? What language do we use around that? Everyone is welcome. We might hear no one will be turned away, but what are the implications of the language we use? The energy of no one will be turned away versus everyone is welcome. It's very different. Like, even the picture that might pop into your head is different of seeing someone turned away because you've said the word. So there are lots of ways that in the language that we use that we can add to and bolster up the kinds of accessibility that we are providing, so that it's more than just the crumbs, right? That we are intentional about it, and that we are really bringing a richness through that intention of truly being inclusive and bringing everyone into the fold of community. And when we are making it accessible, it's not just so you can get here, but it's so that you can fully participate and receive the transformational teachings that we provide week after week. Any thoughts or comments about that?
I wanted to comment really quickly about the technological one and Unity, because so I've worked on 3 Unity Center websites, and I've looked at several because I do the website for Unity of Springfield. And I'm talking about the Unity, Unity centers. we're not very accessible when it comes to our websites. Like even just the basics that like ADA compliance with images. There are very few Unity centers that are just compliant with the very, foundational stuff when it comes to websites and technology. I think some of it's just people don't know how to use the technology, but there's a lot of resources out there to help you use, to
Mhm.
help you use it correctly. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention is in terms of technology and the Unity movement, is that's somewhere where we could really develop a lot more.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I just discovered as I was preparing the PowerPoint for this session, which is really curious to me, how it came into my awareness. Was I just paying more attention that PowerPoint has a whole accessibility tool? I didn't know that. And so it will, use AI to generate all, text options for your images. And then you can, of course, correct that or, rewrite it or whatever. But I didn't know that. And so I don't know what triggered that. I don't know if I put a picture in that already had that or if it was just in my awareness. And so I noticed. And so I kind of, opted through that, but it'll go through font size and color and placement for readability, and those are the things, what you're talking about, James, that a lot of people don't think about, unless it impacts you, so unless it impacts you or someone you love and it's in your immediate awareness, you're probably not thinking about how important, it's not just about pretty colors on a website, or nice pictures, and what happens if you can't see the picture. And so I notice a lot of people even on social media will put text or photo description. They'll say, it'll name, two women holding hands, happy, smiling on a sunny day, walking on a beach or whatever. And you'll notice that, and that's for accessibility, and behind that is love and care and connection. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, all of that that y'all just shared takes me back to um, how how do we know this? Like, you're someone, Jackie, that I happen to know is very, schooled in media and technology and that sort of thing. And you kind of sort of, I'm putting words in your mouth maybe, but fell into something this morning
Mm-hmm.
that just happened to catch your attention.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the education piece that I was mentioning before. Is like, how does someone like myself, who is not high in technology, skills or awareness and all, how do I, or what can we create that someone like me could just have a working list of things you might want to look for in
Mm-hmm.
terms of being accessible? Because I've been wanting for a long time to ask one of our deaf interpreters here why they put that written description of a photo, because I just associated it with, well, maybe it has something to do with the deaf community, and I just haven't made that opportunity to ask. And here you just gave me the answers to why that is, and it's not that. It has to do again with just the way the image is seen.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, that's the question in my mind is, how can we teach and how can I learn these things when I'm not even sure what, what what it would benefit me to learn in order to be more
Right.
accessible or create more accessibility,
Yeah.
so
It's a great question. We never know what we don't know.
yeah.
ah, all the time, every day, we don't know what we don't know. And and to your point that, you might notice that and you're maybe trying to figure out how is this helpful to a deaf person. Um, but really it's the deaf person or your example, you're talking about deaf interpreters or ASL interpreters. Is that they are more in tune and aware of access. And so it's more of the culture. There's more awareness there. And I think that's the key is curiosity, which I don't think we've had a session since I've started that hasn't included curiosity and just asking the questions. How we'll think about it like when you write a talk or even writing an announcement for a service. Will this be interesting to people in the room? How it will be entertaining? How will it, be touching? How will it open hearts? How will it be funny? We ask all these questions and we have these curiosities um, with other people in mind, right? To connect. And so if we bring into those curiosities, how will this be accessible to or how will it impact someone who's neurodivergent? How will this analogy that I'm using? I remember really stepping in it when I was fairly new at UCOP and we were still online. And I say that because it was a time when I was very disconnected with the community. I didn't see them week after week. I looked into the camera to give the talk for Sundays. But I used this beautiful, beautiful analogy with a seashell. And I had my conch shell, I had it there. And this was great spiritual depth, I'm sure. And, but about listening into it. And so later in conversation with one of our ASL interpreters, it's like something like that falls flat with the deaf community. There's no, so the interpreter, while I'm giving my spiritual, diamonds of a talk, the interpreter's having to explain that when hearing people put the shell up, they hear a sound that they call the ocean. No, it's not the ocean. So I can say that, and those who are hearing and who have had an opportunity to listen to that or heard about it can immediately relate, and I can skip steps in my communication of that, right? Because there's an immediate visceral memory and experiential reaction or something that comes up, connection that comes up. But for someone who has never had that, there are more steps that need to be shared in order to make it relevant. And then to a deaf person and I don't remember any really detail about that particular story, but is that even a relevant teaching? And then when we tie it into, scripture, there is so much in scripture that talks about, uses analogy of the deaf and the dumb as being poor in spirit and or as being sinful. And so our deaf community has been marginalized spiritually because of that. And so to even have the curiosity of how is this going to impact will inform how I use different scripture. It will inform how I use a story or an analogy or a metaphor. And not that I get it 100% at all. I don't know what I don't know every day, but what I can do is stay curious and ask the questions. And so, and then always be intentional about broadening the scope. And that takes the same for everything else. It takes education. It takes getting to know people who have different abilities or disabilities than you have. I think aging for me personally has opened my eyes, and I remember probably 20 years ago listening to a speaker say, you aren't disabled yet. And so keep in mind that your body is going in one direction and as you age. And so that might rub for some people in a Unity environment, might rub up against like our theology or not. And we live in a physical world and we have an aging process that we all experience to different degrees and that we all manage differently. So that was kind of an eye opener, but I was young enough at the time that it still felt very distant, and now as I approach 50 and, this last Sunday, I had someone on the platform with me and an author of a book, and I offered to have her read a quote from her book. And she was like, I didn't bring my readers up here. And I'm aware of that, but not aware enough, because my vision is starting to change, but I still can get away with it. But so I don't have that immediate awareness to have thought in advance to ask her if she would be able to read that and to plan, because I'm thinking I can just hand her the book. I know she is a sighted person, can see, so it's the awareness and it's a constant cultivation. And then knowing when we step in it, we're just it's going to happen. We're going to step in it just like we do in anything else in life. And then folding that into the learning and the awareness and moving forward with it. James.
So I just wanted to say really quickly that the integration for Microsoft 365, I knew it was recent. It was April when they integrated the
So it's new.
accessibility into three. So it's very new. But I also wanted to say that as well to what Eileen was saying. I will say that AI integration, like they did accessibility AI integration into Canva about 6 or 7 months ago, and into WordPress about 4 months ago. And so we have this new resource that is being just integrated into all of our technology. And so I think you're going to just be seeing it more and more and more, and it will increase awareness so that I know when it was integrated into Canva, it drastically increased my awareness into what I was posting on social media. I was like, oh, okay. So,
Yeah.
and it helps you see things differently. So I think a lot of these resources, I know a lot of people are huge fans of AI, but I think a lot of these resources are
Mhm.
brilliant in how they just expand our awareness and our consciousness and how others interact with the world and how we interact with the world. So I wanted to add that since you were asking about that as
Thank
well.
you. Well, I'm glad to know that it's new. So I haven't just been using PowerPoint, which I didn't use PowerPoint for many, many years. But I've used it long enough that I felt a little odd that I hadn't noticed that. So it's new. Yay. Yay. But also, yeah, 100%. I mean, these tools are here for those who can use them in the ways that they can be used to make us, to increase our ability to connect with people, right? And to increase our ability to communicate with people. So why wouldn't we? And and so I've noticed too, like you, Eileen, that people on social media will take the time to describe the images, and I make a choice not to do that. And it's lazy, or it's I'm in a hurry, or I don't think I have any friends who need that, on my social media, or on and every excuse in the book. Or I could make a choice to, like, actually that would be a way that I can demonstrate my commitment to connection, right? So I just use myself as an example there, because I have my own growing edges, and it's we can't be all the things and do all the things all the time, but we can always be in a state of doing better, right? Better than we were. And for me, when I think of and I tie it to that point of connection and serving the work of love, it becomes more important to me. And then I also have the intrinsic um experience, the result of being in alignment, right, with my values, and demonstrating that. And so, we don't do it to virtue signal, right? We're not doing it to, oh, look, and that's the difference between just doing something because we've heard we ought to do it and to make us look good and so connected. Which I think at Unity Church of Overland Park there was a point where I felt that by having an ASL interpreter on Sundays, it was a little bit of virtue signaling, meaning, look, we provide this, because there was nothing else happening to support the deaf community, to be involved with small groups, to come to classes. There was nothing else happening in the room on Sunday to create a hybrid deaf hearing space. So that has been, over the course of 3.5 years, a real learning curve for us, to not just provide a crumb, which to some people would say that's a lot. That's a financial investment to provide an interpreter just for the Sundays. But what else can we do? So if we have multiple speakers, do we have more than one interpreter? What happens in the room for, so then the deaf folks can only talk to each other, or the interpreters, or communicate to each other, or the interpreters. So we added boogie boards, which is like an etch a sketch. Um, you know, that's not an etch a sketch, but you can write on it and erase it very easily, quickly. They are inexpensive, and we have what, 2, 3 laying around. We have 2, and so we let the hearing community know. Grab that. Also, you can use, and so this is about just educating people. You can use your notes app in your phone to write and have a conversation with a deaf person. And so it's about understanding that the communication barrier is also yours. It's shared. If you don't know ASL, you also need an interpreter. And so it's an opportunity to take ownership in that. And then what can I do then to connect? And so that also softens the edges around, well, isn't it enough that we have an interpreter on the platform for you? Right? No, we actually want to embrace as a community that it's not you, the deaf people, it's all of us who have come together on a Sunday, and how can we do better to connect? And then it's also having a small group. And there's been some conversation about that. Because at first we had a small group, a deaf small group, so facilitated by a deaf person for deaf people, meaning the group would only be in ASL, and that was important to the deaf community. So it wasn't meant to be exclusionary to hearing people, but so that the deaf folks could communicate in their small group in their native language. So in the same way, if we had enough, Spanish speaking folks, that we would have a group offered only in Spanish or a service offered only in Spanish. Now, for the first time, we have one of our interpreters who is truly bilingual. Her first language was ASL. She's a hearing person. Um, and she is facilitating the group in ASL, but opened it to hearing people and provided an interpreter. So she doesn't interpret, she communicates only in ASL, and then we have interpreters. And that's been a really interesting experience. And I would say it's kind of opened some discomfort. And so but again, it's a growing edge, and it's, what are we here to do? How are we here to connect with each other, to serve the work of love, and to create community and deepen our bonds as community? So those are just some examples of what we've experienced. Is anything else coming up for any of you?
I actually have a question. So we had a blind person coming to Unity of Springfield for a while, and I had remembered reading something about having a lot of Unity resources in Braille, but we
Mm,
couldn't find them. Is that still going on, Unity Worldwide
that
Ministries
is
or
a
Unity
great
headquarters?
question. So there used to be a daily word in Braille, and I don't know, James. I don't know if that is still the case, but I will,
Okay.
because that is a great question. Yeah.
Because I still have her contact info because she was asking for resources, and I said, I remember reading this somewhere. And then, I mean, this was just maybe a couple months ago, and I couldn't really find a lot on the website, but the website was going through all these changes. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Great question. I will find out and send an email out about that. Anything coming up for you, Nicole?
I love your use of the word curiosity and growing edges. I'm curious how, when I agree, like a lot of this is self-education, right? We have to take the initiative to find out more that we don't know. Um, but how do you keep the momentum going within your congregation when, like, to me, learning takes me back to my childhood, and there's a lot of patterns that we fall back into when we're
Mhm.
learning new things, that might cause people to step back. And I know processing time is needed, but how do we
Mhm.
keep the engagement going when we're doing this work so that there's motivation around the why, the oneness,
Yeah.
the value system?
That's a great question. For me, I think that it's important to not overwhelm people. Um, in the same way, Eileen has done a lot of work with around anti-racism, and you've got to let people move slowly through change. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And I sum it up with trauma informed care, right? We are in a society that has, especially right now in an election year, has so much going on and so much opportunity for division and so much discomfort, even in family systems and social systems and work systems and all of that. That if we want to make change and really, I would say, evolve our culture, that it's important to do it slowly and intentionally, and we don't have to do all the things at one time. um, so there may be times that warrant big changes. I do not deny that, and don't disagree with that. But there are also, it can be great benefit for a slow drip, you know, and it could be first, and foremost, from the leadership, demonstrating, because people will notice, people notice. So for a time of meditation, I invite you to close your eyes or soften your gaze. Why? Because the deaf folks in the room need to keep their eyes open to watch the interpreter. Other people might be terrified to close their eyes in a room full of people. We have students who have grown up being trained for active shooter drills, and there are shootings happening in churches, and so there are lots of reasons, lots and lots of reasons. There are people who are neurodivergent, there are people, lots of different experiences happening in the room, and we can't possibly know all of it. But what I can do is invite someone, invite the room to close your eyes or soften your gaze. And what that does is it gives permission for people to be in their skin just as they are. So any way that we can find to do that, I will from time to time. I don't do it every week. Again, this is kind of that slow drip, but every so often I will remind people, if during our meditation time you need to get up and move, that's okay to do here. And put your, place your feet flat on the floor if that feels comfortable for you. If we have people raise their hand, and so there's that, if you're willing and able. And yes, I use that, but when I'm really conscious and aware, I'll say, if you're willing and able, raise your hands or stand up, or simply raise your aura, and something like that, that is fun and is not just a crumb of like, oh yeah, I see that you're in a wheelchair and you can't stand up. So only those who are willing and able, but the rest of you sit, like there's just when we get into a roteness, there's also this energy of not caring. Like, I'm only going to, just do this thing. But when I started saying, or, raise your aura right where you are, smiles, and there were some people who had started to stand who just sat back down, because the effort of standing, the pain of sitting and feeling uncomfortable was greater than the pain of standing, but it was still going to be painful to stand. Immediately had permission to just stay where they were, and the smile, and they lifted, because we don't have to stand to lift your, to create that energy shift. So, it can start at the leadership level, and just with simple things like that, and people will notice, and that it begins a shift in the culture, and it begins a loosening and a breaking up of old patterns like you're talking about. And then you start, with one change here. Um, whatever that might be, if it's an architectural space change, if it's a financial accessibility change, if it's a systemic change, if it's about your website, whatever it is, you don't have to tackle all the things all at once. But when somebody who needs the access that you're working with notices that you are doing something, then they can be patient, then they can feel seen, then they can feel, important and valued in the community. James.
I just wanted to add to that too, with Nicole's question. And Jackie, I don't know if this has been your experiences. This has been my experience in 3 different communities. When we brought in the conversation about, diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, there tends to be a few people when we start having that conversation that get really engaged and really excited. And so the conversation doesn't like always end up just being the leader or the few leaders. Those people pick it up, and then it seems to branch out a bit, sort of like what Rev D was saying, when you speak to the people that are already closest, and they'll reach the people that are sort of on the outside. And I don't know if that's just been a unique experience in the communities that I've been a part of, or if that's just how it goes. You will definitely have some people that are really engaged and excited that will sort of carry it, and then you don't know it's not all on your shoulders.
Exactly. And the leaders must also be on board with it, and I say the ministers, the staff, the board, all must have, and so like our board has been trying to, and it has not worked yet, but has been trying to schedule a field trip to the Kansas School for the Deaf. Is that what we're trying? No, it's the museum. I think it's in the same kind of location, but there's a Kansas Museum for the Deaf, which is, I think, the only one in the country, or at least has the largest exhibit. And so Eileen has gone, right? You've been there, you've taken a tour, but we haven't been able to get the board together. But that is a commitment, and it is on our agenda to have that done. And so, it's a way to just, we did the same thing when there was the redlining exhibit at the county museum. As we encourage people to go, and really encourage the leaders to go, and to make time for that, because then you're expanding the consciousness, and with key people who have impact in the community. But yes, you're right, James. Then it creates opportunity for people to come into leadership. Like, they might not feel like they can facilitate a small group, but they can get on board with, justice work, or making change, or expressing love through accessibility. So yeah, absolutely. I'm going to share my screen again because I just have a few more slides. But we're kind of touching on some of this. So vulnerability. And I put diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging because vulnerability touches on each one of these words. And it touches on what it takes to even be human, for one, but to gather in spiritual community. So, in spiritual community, we serve the work of love. We have theology, we have principles, we have values, and we demonstrate our theology, our principles, and values. That's our fifth principle. Um, and we are all vulnerable in our humanity, and we are all unlimited in our divinity. So, working with that energy and those principles, but also keeping in mind the vulnerability in that, what it takes for someone. Um, I've even had like the time of the start time for service. I have had someone say to me, I'm older now and it takes me longer to get ready. So, could we just move the service a little bit later? It would never have crossed my mind that that would be a reason for someone to prefer the starting time of a service. Now, we didn't make that change, um, but the awareness, which then feeds into when you're thanking someone for coming on a Sunday or for coming to any event, it increases the depth of our gratitude and the understanding. It's not just thanks for being here and for showing up, but when we can put behind that an awareness of what it takes for someone to show up, then it deepens our love, it deepens our connection, and it is felt, right? And it increases the experience and the belonging, that sense of belonging in community. This is my last slide. And it's about language and spiritual spaces, which I've kind of touched on, being trauma informed, in the way that we offer our meditation, in the way that we communicate, and provide safety in the room, and even use the word safety. Lots of parents will come in and ask, what is the safety plan? What, and it might be about storms, it might be about fire, or it might be about keeping my child from being kidnapped or removed by someone who shouldn't be removing them, or it might be about active shooter. So understanding the culture that we are in broadly and what is coming into the room and how we can speak to those ideas. The power of permission. We talk about in unity being open to honoring all paths to God. So we have theological permission. We have a lot of cultural permission we don't have strict dogma that we require of people. But how much are we leveraging the power of permission to really be who you are in this space, in our Sunday space, in our classroom space, in our, Tuesday night space, whatever that is. In that, are we providing accessibility so that people can really show up as they are and who they are? Are we providing the right kind of care and concern and awareness for people to be successful in our spaces? Are we avoiding ableist language in our talks? Are we using it's just like the blind leading the blind? Are we using that kind of ableist language in our talks, in our announcements, in our meditations? Are we, so I'll say something like, and this is, I'm using the example because it has been a very intentional growing edge for me, because I've been wanting to cultivate and grow the deaf community and the presence of the deaf community. And I'll tell you why. Because we have already a long time commitment of providing ASL access. So that was already in the community for decades. But also the deaf community has very little access to a spirituality like unity. Their most common access to spiritual community is traditional Christianity, and the most consistent message they have is that their deafness is a curse. And so I've had, one of our congregants talk to me about how she was taken up in front of the church at age 11 to be healed from her deafness. She is in like 13 generations back deaf in her family. And that's just because that's as far as they can go. So probably more. So she was taken up in front of the church at the age of 11, and she was getting prayed over, and the pastor clapped, and she jumped because she felt the burst of air and was declared healed. She was not healed of her deafness, nor does she want to be healed of her deafness. She's very proud of it. So to understand and know that there's an entire community of deaf folks out there who have very little access to the transformational teachings that we offer in Unity makes me want to provide access to them. So back to meditation and announcements and language of, so as you hear the voice of God, I really try not to say that. And if I say it, I will also say receive a message, receive guidance. I try to replace. And so I'm not going to get it 100%, but I try to get it better than I did before. And now I will also say that interpreters in our conversations will say, well, it's their job to change that in the interpretation. But if I can first, demonstrate my own awareness in that, then the interpreter doesn't have to work that hard. And it levels the playing field, so to speak, of the access of the language and the experience of the divine in a person, right? If we aren't saying that it's through hearing God, that's not your access to God. That's just a hearing person's way of saying, I heard a voice. So if we can start to shift that, then we're also really at the core of it talking about access to the divine and how we describe that, which is language falls short, regardless of your hearing or what language you're speaking. And we know that. But if I can do my part to make it better and more inclusive, and then it also actually helps me evolve my own ideas and my own connection with the divine. So, and in the divine. And then the last thing I wanted to show, we're almost out of time, is non-disabled versus able-bodied. So the newer language is to use non-disabled because able-bodied centers the able-bodied person. So it's always able-bodied, which is very similar to saying normal, and then the disabled folks. But when we say non-disabled and disabled, then we're centering, bringing more to center the disability. And so kind of, James, you spoke to that about reclaiming that. And so you will see that in writings, like in blogs, and you'll also hear it when people are using it in speaking language. But it might be something to consider to work in. And for me, the impact was that centering. It was like, oh, okay, so if I don't center able-bodied, it changes, it shifts energy. It also shifts my awareness, and all of that to me is part of expanding. It is part of expanding my experience of love and connection, which is what, my goal is week after week. And the very last slide is your homework for our next session, which will be on May 23rd. Our reflection session on this is to survey community members on the accessibility of your service and your space. So consider, everything that we talked about, the 5 barriers: physical, architectural, communication, language, technological, organizational, systemic, and attitudinal. Just talk to a few folks who who might require more access, and just ask some questions. It doesn't have to be a full formal survey, but just ask a couple questions. How is it for you to get in and out of the building? How is it for you to go through our website? And there are lots of different ways that we create unintended barriers. So just have a conversation. And then for extra credit, to visit that soiltjp.org, and that's where you're going to see more of Mia Mingus's work. And like I said, I'm taking a deep dive because the system she has created, I think, will overlay really nicely in spiritual community. And then in June, we will meet on the second Thursday, June 13th, for Meet Me at the Intersection, Advocacy and Power. All right. Any questions or final comments?
Thank you, all of you.
Yeah.
Appreciated the conversation, learned a lot, and looking forward to the homework, actually. And I rarely said that in my life over the years.
Awesome. And I don't grade you, and there's really no extra credit, but just to entice you a little bit, So, well, thank you all. Thank you for your contribution to the conversation and for being here for this important work that we're doing. All right. Have a beautiful day. We'll see you all in a couple of weeks.